Resident Evil Genesis, a novelization by Keith R.A. DeCandido. Chapter 6. The only thing the Red Queen's security cameras picked up was the human figure in the hazmat suit. Somehow, someone had found a way to get into the suit without the ubiquitous cameras recording the action. However, the Red Queen, despite her artificial intelligence, was still at heart a literal-minded machine. The person in the hazmat suit entered the proper security codes to get through the titanium-reinforced door to the temperature-regulated room that housed the T-virus. Therefore, the computer did not question the identity of the individual, even though the suit's reflective faceplate sufficiently hid the person's identity from the cameras. The first thing the figure did was walk over to one of the utility closets and remove a hypo gun and a metal case. While not as well reinforced as the door, that was impossible to achieve without sacrificing portability. The case was impenetrable by most standards when sealed. As for the gun, it fit neatly into one of the case's slots, as the other slots were intended to house small cylindrical tubes. The figure walked over to the far wall. That wall included a window of plastiglass, a stronger version of plexiglass that Umbrella had patented the year before. Under the window sat a horizontal slot, which the figure opened by activating a control. It slid downward, allowing the case to be placed into the small chamber on the other side of the window and slot. Smoky condensation puffed out through the slot, as the temperature inside the chamber was quite low, and only the hazmat suit kept the figure from feeling the overwhelming cold that issued forth. The slot closed once the case was ensconced within. The activating of several other controls brought about two more actions. 2 Waldos unfurled from sides of the plexiglass window, and the bottom of the chamber slid open to reveal 14 vials. The latter action was only possible when the slot below the window was shut. Manipulating the Waldos, the figure systematically placed each of the vials into the slots. Each vial contained corkscrew-shaped tubes that looked like a cross between a DNA double helix and a silly straw. Half were filled with a deep blue liquid, the other half with a liquid in a kind of sick green. The T-virus and the antivirus. Worth millions to pharmaceuticals as the basis of a revolutionary product that would allow vain middle-aged people to look more like vain younger people. Worth billions on the open market in its raw form as a biological weapon. Behind the reflective faceplate, the figure smiled. This was a weapon of mass destruction beyond any world leader's wildest dreams or nightmares. Once all 14 vials were in place, the case shut automatically and sealed itself. 4 circular dials on the 4 corners of the case lid rotated 90 degrees, indicating that the case was sealed tighter than a proverbial drum. Only someone with the key code could open it now. With the tray cleared of the vials and the case sealed, the computer, literal-minded as ever, would allow the slot to open once again. When it did, the figure grabbed the case and brought it out of the temperature-controlled room and into the adjacent laboratory. Like all the office spaces in the hive, the lab was utilitarian, favoring cold metal and hard plastics, not only in the furnishings, but everything from the molding to the computer desktops. It had no warmth to it at all, like a tomb. Soon enough, it would be a tomb in reality as well as imagery. The figure removed the hazmat suit, put on a pair of rubber gloves, and entered the key code. The case obligingly opened, an action that served 2 functions: to verify that the key code worked, and to allow the figure access to one of the vials containing the blue liquid. Pulling out the vial with a protected hand, the figure sealed the case once again, placed it in a duffel bag, zipped the bag up, and hoisted it onto one shoulder. Before departing the lab, the figure tossed the vial toward the center of the room, then turned, exited, and closed and locked the door. The vial tumbled end over end and through the air in a graceful arc until it collided with the edge of one of the metal desks. Glass shattered, interior tubing broke, shards splayed out onto the cold metal floor, blue liquid pooling around it. A miasma emitted from the blue liquid into the air. It headed toward the air conditioning vents. Maintaining as complex an underground system as the hive required tremendous feats of engineering. It also required a beyond-the-top-of-the-line air conditioning system that regulated the constant flow of oxygen and carbon dioxide in proper amounts to keep the 500 people living and working there alive and comfortable, not to mention the assorted lab animals and guard dogs. It was an efficient system. It had to be, or the hive would not be viable. So, it didn't take long at all for the T-virus to make its deadly way through the complex. The Red Queen, still literal-minded, had not blinked when the figure removed all the samples of the deadliest virus ever created by the human race, because the figure had entered all the right security codes. But when that same virus was detected in the air of the hive, there was only one thing she could do. Evacuating the hive would not be practical. It was physically impossible to remove all 523 human beings from the underground complex without risking the virus spreading, which meant that those human beings were as good as dead, as was any other living creature within the hive that breathed the air provided by the beyond-the-top-of-the-line air conditioning system. The Red Queen's first directive was self-preservation, which meant preservation of the hive. She began the process of sealing off the hive. That would take about 15 minutes. Then she'd do the rest. Chapter 7. Mark Torvaldsen loved his job. He'd just started working for the Umbrella Corporation, and today was his first day in the hive, Umbrella's state-of-the-art underground facility. True, he had to live in a big hole in the ground. On the other hand, he had a 5-year guaranteed contract and was working in his dream job. The research and development he'd be doing in pharmaceuticals put him on the cutting edge of his field. The best part, though, was the 5-year contract. Through high school and college, Mark had formed several close friendships, primary among them being Vince Markinson, Jack Anachiarico, and Eleanor Wu. The awesome foursome they called themselves, and they'd been inseparable throughout their teen years. Attended each other's major life events, including Vince's wedding to his on-again, off-again girlfriend, and Jack's and Eleanor's wedding to each other. And still got together once a month for their bad movie night. Unfortunately, bad movie night had been getting to be somewhat depressing of late, after making big bucks during the dot-com boom doing quality assurance for companies who thought that acquiring a cool-sounding URL was the ticket to fame and fortune. Vince soon lost first his job, then his wife. 2 years later, he was struggling to find freelance work and seriously considered taking a job driving a cab. Jack, after moving from computer programming to management, found himself out of work, and his programming skills too out of date to make him employable in a depressed economy. Just last week, Eleanor was downsized when the accounting firm she worked for decided to cut costs. Meanwhile, Mark was living in fear of his own employment prospects by the growing instability of his own company. Profits were down, and it looked very likely that the company was going to go under. Instead, the company was bought by its primary competitor, the Umbrella Corporation. Shortly thereafter, they dissolved the company and laid off all of the employees. But some were offered new positions within Umbrella. Mark was flattered to be one of them, especially since they offered more security, more money, and more interesting work. Given what his closest friends were going through, having to live in a hole in the ground seemed a small price to pay. He wasn't sure if he'd be able to attend bad movie night for a while, but that was looking more and more like it was a good thing. Vince was getting increasingly depressed, and Eleanor's ability to stay employed was the only thing keeping her and Jack going. Much as he loved the idea of viewing Evil Brain from Outer Space, or the incredibly strange creatures who stopped living and became mixed-up zombies, with his oldest and dearest friends, Mark had the feeling that the bad movie nights weren't going to be any fun for some time. Least of all for the one person in the group still gainfully employed. Not that his new job would give him much time for fun, but that was okay. At least he had a job. The residence they provided for him in the Hive was actually nicer than his apartment in downtown Raccoon City had been, and the cafeteria was well stocked. Mark could barely boil water, and the idea of living somewhere where the food was provided appealed to him greatly. On this, his first morning at the new job, he had only a cup of coffee. Never much of a breakfast eater, Mark really only needed his morning caffeine to get himself started, and that did him until he took lunch at around 1 or so. The cafeteria had a nice French toast, and he had served himself a cup with some milk and equal. He didn't bother with a lid. He preferred his coffee lukewarm, and leaving the top exposed cooled it down faster. He headed toward the elevator that would take him from the cafeteria level to his office in pharmaceuticals. Coffee securely in his right hand, the gray jacket of his brand-new suit slung over his right arm. Someone collided with his back, sending him stumbling forward and jostling his right arm. A sharp stab of heat seeped into his chest, right over his heart, where the still-hot coffee spilled on his new white shirt, and a great deal of the liquid splattered onto the jacket he had over his right arm as well. Mark looked up to see the retreating form of the person who had bumped him, moving purposefully down the hall, not having even broken stride after the collision. "Thank you!" Mark cried out in annoyance, but whoever it was didn't even turn around. Finishing his approach to the elevator bank, Mark inspected the damage. His ID badge, clipped to his shirt pocket, was dripping coffee, and the stain had gone through both his white shirt and his undershirt. He'd paid hundreds of dollars for this suit. Next time, Mark promised himself, he was going to grab a lid. A pretty young woman with curly hair looked at Mark with sympathy. "Some people," she said sympathetically. "Yeah," Mark muttered. He looked up from his stained clothing to see that the woman had big, beautiful eyes. He ventured a smile. "It's a brand new shirt." "New suit, too?" she asked. Mark wondered if his first-day jitters were that obvious. "Yeah, first day." The woman nodded. "Men don't usually get that worked up over a stain like that unless the suit's new." Chuckling, Mark said, "Yeah, well, I've hardly gotten to use it." He looked down at her ID badge, which gave her name as Ella Fontaine. Mark wondered idly if she was single. Not that there was good reason to wonder this, since he knew damn well that he'd never work up the courage to actually ask her out if she was. The only dates he'd gone on since college were those train-wreck blind dates Jack and Eleanor had set him up with over the last couple of years, which, if anything, had made his fear of talking to women even more pronounced. With a low chime, the elevator announced its arrival. A man in a gray suit exited, and Mark, Ella, a woman in the white shirt, pants, and coat indicating someone who worked in one of the labs, and a few others got on. A wretched Muzak rendition of Simon and Garfunkel's Sound of Silence wafted over the speakers. About 2 seconds after the elevator started moving, it lurched to a halt again. The display had just flipped from 11 to 10. A shrill tone sounded, catching Mark off guard. "What is that?" "Fire drill," Ella said matter-of-factly. "Looks like we'll be taking the stairs." "Taking them where?" Mark asked. "We're underground." "Up." She spoke with the tone of someone who had been through the process dozens of times. "There's a section on the top level that has another staircase that leads to the main office in downtown Raccoon. We usually don't have to go that far, though, just to the section up top. Then when the drill's over, we head back to our offices." Mark supposed that, all things considered, fire safety was something they had to be especially concerned with in the hive. After an interminable time, Mark's watch said it was 15 seconds, though it had felt like an hour. He pushed his way toward the display. "Shouldn't the doors open or something?" He tapped the door open button repeatedly, but nothing happened. The alarm kept going, though. "It's supposed to stop at the nearest floor," Ella said. Mark turned around to see that she, too, had moved forward. Then the lights in the elevator went out. Emergency lights came on a moment later, but now the tiny space of the elevator felt even tinier in the much dimmer illumination. The fire alarm had also stopped. As annoying as it was, Mark found he preferred it to the deathly quiet that ensued in its wake. Mark felt panic well up inside him. Sweat started to bead on his brow and elsewhere. A small part of his brain registered that his chest was getting sweaty too, which meant it was going to mix with the coffee. That small part wanted to giggle hysterically at the idea of salty coffee. Mark had never considered himself especially claustrophobic before. In fact, he'd happily hidden closets as a kid, particularly when he was playing hide-and-seek with his two brothers, and he certainly would never have agreed to work in the hive if he had any problem with enclosed spaces. But then he had never been trapped in an unmoving, dimly lit elevator before either. He was even starting to get nostalgic for the Muzak's sound of silence. Ella, meanwhile, had the presence of mind to grab the emergency phone. Mark admired her good sense, and thought maybe he would have the courage to ask this one out. "Hello?" she said into the phone. A moment of silence passed. "Hello?" she said again, more forcefully this time. The sweat on Mark's brow intensified proportionately to the increased urgency in Ella's tone. When she started pushing buttons next to the phone, seemingly at random, Mark feared the worst. "The line's dead." Now Mark knew that the sweat and the spilled coffee were intermingled, and it was even odds as to whether or not his perspiration would stain the new shirt more than the coffee. He could feel his heart pounding against his ribcage. He clutched his coffee cup so tightly in his right hand that the cardboard started to dent. With his left, he hit the alarm button, which did nothing, then started pushing buttons at random. "What's going on? Has this ever happened before? We have to get out of here! We have to get out of here!" He started pounding the door. One of the other men in the elevator said, "Take it easy." Mark turned angrily on the man. "You take it easy!" Now his heart felt like it was about to burst out of his chest, his breaths coming more rapidly. "Quiet!" Ella cried. Blinking, Mark looked over at Ella, who was holding up a hand. He tried desperately to get his breathing at least under control. "Quiet," she said again, now speaking in a whisper. Ella was looking up and squinting as if trying to hear something. Mark couldn't hear anything except for the pounding of his heart. Then he caught it. A low buzz, increasing in intensity. Another alarm? Then as it got louder, he realized what it was. Screams. People screaming. There was something else, too. A low rumbling that was just under the screaming sounds. At its loudest, Mark was able to place the screaming. It was just to his left. Now the sweat that seemed to cover every inch of Mark's body went cold as he started to realize what it was he was hearing. Both the screaming and the rumbling started to diminish. That, Mark knew, would happen as the next elevator over plunged downward. The screams faded once again into a low buzz. The rumbling went away completely. Mark closed his eyes and tried again to get his breathing under control, and failed miserably. mainly because he knew what was next. He waited for the inevitable subsequent sound, a crunching, explosive noise mixed with wrenched metal and the springing sound of metal cables whipping around. The elevator had hit the bottom. "Oh my God." Ella's voice sounded hollow and lifeless. A description that Mark feared would soon apply to this elevator. This sort of thing wasn't supposed to happen. This was the Umbrella Corporation. They made the best computer equipment and healthcare products in the country. They had the wherewithal to build the most amazing underground complex in the history of humanity. This was not a company that built elevators that plunged to their doom during fire drills. Mark heard a lot of screams. That elevator was full. People were dead. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was supposed to be starting his new dream job, one that would keep him gainfully employed for at least 5 years. People were dead. Sure, people died, but not like this. They died in car accidents or plane crashes, like Mark's Uncle Victor, or of old age or disease like Grandma and Grandpa. They didn't die during fire drills on their first day at work. That just didn't happen. Mark refused to believe it. Then, all of a sudden, his stomach felt like it was slamming up into his chest as the elevator started plummeting to its doom. When he was a kid, Mark always used to love roller coasters, even as his brothers screamed in joyous panic at the twists and turns the coaster took them on, and yelling in thrilling fear at the feel of the air as it slammed into their faces. Mark would always sit next to them with a big grin on his face. He loved being tossed around like that. This panic, however, was nothing like joyous, and the fear was quite real. So this time, Mark screamed. Dimly, he registered that the other occupants of the elevator were also screaming, but that wasn't as important to Mark as the stunning realization that he was going to die. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He was starting a new job. He'd have the job for at least 5 years. He'd be gainfully employed. He wouldn't be living in the misery that his friends were toiling in. A screeching sound penetrated the wall of screams, and Mark realized that the emergency brakes were finally kicking in. Moments later, the elevator slammed to a halt, and Mark collapsed to the ground, both his jacket and what was left of his coffee spilling to the floor. He clambered quickly to his feet, reveling in the feeling of being alive. Peculiarly, the most overwhelming feeling he had was elation that he'd be alive to attend the next bad movie night. In fact, he was determined to go no matter what kind of hoops he had to jump through. The prospect of being able to see Bride of the Monster with his closest friends was suddenly the happiest thought he could have. Ella had already risen, and she was now walking to the doors. Mark looked up to see that the elevator had apparently stopped on the 3rd floor. He then looked over to see that Ella had removed a Swiss Army knife from somewhere on her person and was using its blade to try to pry open the elevator doors. He was about to offer assistance. Ella was tiny and couldn't have had much upper arm strength, when the doors, with a screeching noise that was eerily similar to the emergency brakes, started to separate. She then methodically stuck her fingers between the doors and started to pry them apart. One of the other men got up to give her a hand. "I can't get a good grip," Ella muttered. Noticing that there was a blank wall on the other side of the door, Mark said, "We're not on a floor." "Yeah, we are," one of the men pointed to the floor. Only then did Mark notice the small shaft of light poking through. From the looks of it, the elevator had finally come to a halt just as it was about to pass the 3rd floor. The bottom of the elevator was currently about 2 feet down from the top of the 3rd floor elevator doors. Ella let the doors close on the blade of the knife, then got down on her knees, moving the knife blade with her toward the floor. Mark winced as the blade scraped against the door, giving him shivers up and down his spine. All things considered, though, he didn't really mind it, especially given the alternatives. Again, Ella squeezed her fingers between the doors, trying to pry them apart. being able to stick her fingers farther out through the gap between the top of the outer doors and the bottom of the elevator's inner doors. She was able to get them open at least a little bit. Enough at least to see the third floor, get someone's attention and ask for help. Maybe ask what in God's name was going on while they were at it. My God! Mark looked up. Ella's voice sounded, if it were possible, even more hollow and lifeless. His breath started going shallow again. He wasn't sure how much more of this he could take. A fervent desire to go hide in a corner warred in Mark's mind with a desperate need to see what Ella saw. Against his better judgment, the latter prevailed. Blinking a fresh influx of sweat out of his eyes, he practically pushed Ella to the side. Let me see. Bodies. Mark saw at least 7 or 8 people lying on the floor. They seemed to have just fallen down in a random pattern. Some wore suits, others the all-white lab outfits. Not surprisingly, given that it was his first day, Mark didn't recognize any of them. Some he couldn't even see their faces. He was no doctor. The view he had was obstructed. But he knew the instant he looked at them that all those people were dead. They weren't moving, they weren't breathing, and they weren't going to. We have to get out of here. Mark tore his gaze from the bodies and stood up. We have to get out of this building. One of the other men gave him a look that said, You're damn right, and the 2 of them knelt down and tried to pry the doors farther apart. Here, give me a hand. Mark curled his fingers around one door, while the other guy did likewise for the opposite door. With all his might, fueled by fear and desperation, he pulled. The doors didn't move any farther apart. That's as far as they'll go. The other man nodded. They're caught on something. A voice from behind Mark said, That's wide enough. Mark turned to see Ella shrugging her jacket off. I think I can squeeze through, she said. I'll get help. Looking over the slim woman, Mark had to agree that if nothing else, she was the only person in the elevator who even had a chance of getting through the tiny gap. He also promised himself that if they did somehow get out of this, he was definitely asking this woman out. Ella got down on her stomach, snaked her right arm through the gap, then started to worm her head in. After a moment, her forward motion stopped. I'm stuck! You're going to have to push! Mark immediately grabbed her back and started guiding it forward. That's it! A bit more! Just as her head got all the way through, Mark heard a sharp metallic sound. What is that? He asked, even though in his gut he knew what it was. Oh, Christ, said the other guy. It's the brakes! Another crack. This time the elevator lurched slightly. Get out! We've got to get out! He started to push Ella forward. Ella screamed, I can't move! Mark noticed that her neck was stuck in the gap. The doors had closed slightly, and now it was too narrow for either her head or her shoulders. Undaunted, he kept pushing. But her shoulders simply were not going to get through. A third crack. Then a fourth. This time, Mark's stomach slammed into his throat. The elevator free fell downward, but this time he didn't scream. He couldn't, but he did hear Ella scream. And that was why Mark could not scream, because he realized that Ella's head and arm were still jutting out into the 3rd floor, even as the elevator was about to plunge past that floor. Then it stopped. Again, Mark was knocked to the floor, but the fall wasn't as bad. As he had already been kneeling down, he quickly looked over to see that Ella was still lying on the floor. The elevator was now fully on the 3rd floor, the bottom of the elevator even with the 3rd floor elevator bay. A wave of relief washed over Mark at the sound of Ella's voice. It was barely above a whisper, but at least she still had a head with which to form the words, Pull me back! The words were barely audible, but it was enough to spur both Mark and the other man to action. They pulled on her legs, trying to get her back within the comparatively safe confines of the elevator. Comparatively being the operative word. Was any place in the hive truly safe? Dead bodies in the next elevator over, dead bodies in the elevator bay. Who knew how many other dead bodies? This was just a fire drill, wasn't it? Suddenly, Mark found it hard to breathe, and there was an odd smell in the air. "Push her out of the way," the other guy said. "We've got to get out." But Mark was having trouble breathing, and it had nothing to do with his state of fear. This was more than that. He had a tightness in his chest. "Pull me back inside!" Ella was screaming now. Mark looked down to see that her head was still wedged between the doors. The other guy was making a half-hearted effort to pull the doors apart, but he was overcome by a coughing fit. Mark tried to move over to the doors to help, but he couldn't make his limbs work properly. Then his stomach lurched downward. The elevator was moving upward. Again, Ella screamed. Mark Torvaldsen would spend the rest of his life hearing the squelching sound of flesh and bone being crushed as the floor of the elevator and the upper portion of the third-floor elevator doorframe passed each other, severing Ella's head from the rest of her body in as grisly a manner as possible. Luckily for Mark, the rest of his life was only a few more seconds. He could now taste the gas in the air, even as breathing became more and more impossible. His last thoughts were regret that he wouldn't be able to invite Ella to bed movie night,